Hello, dear students. Today we start our lesson about life and death, meaning of life, discipline by philosophy. My name is Khmelnytska Olesya Mikhailовna. This course for students of all specialties. Let's start. This plan our lesson. The first, significance of problem of the meaning of life for a person. Opinions of understanding of meaning of life. The concept of purpose and meaning, their connection and difference. The problem of immortality incorrect worldview. And start our lecture.
Philosophers and colleagues who really helped me get to where I am now. I see many co-authors and former fellow students in the audience and co-members of the department. So I thought before I start my talk, which is indeed, as Nicholas said, a new area of research for me, which is an interpretation of Epicurus' view of the good life, I should tell you what I really think about philosophy and LSE. Now I'm a professor, I can say what I like, right? Are you ready, Miklos?
Yes, I am.
So there's the founder of our department, Karl Popper. There's the philosophy department. And here is what Popper himself said about philosophy in general, or as he called it, simply the rational method. Whenever we propose a solution to a problem, we ought to try as hard as we can to overthrow our solution rather than defend it. But he was aware, and even he himself was not very good at this advice. And so he said, few of us, unfortunately, practice this, but other people, fortunately, will supply the criticism for us. Now, you might think if this is the slogan of the philosophy department, and it still is, that all we do all day long is tear down each other's arguments, doesn't make for a very nice place to be, you would think. And there is some heated debate in the department. But in the end, I would say, beyond this being our motto, we also have an Epicurean motto. And this is what Epicurus, almost 2,500 years ago, said about philosophy. In other occupations, the reward comes with difficulty after their completion. But in philosophy, learning and enjoyment come together. And this has indeed been my experience so far, most of the time, in the seminars and co-teaching and classrooms of the philosophy department, that we really do enjoy doing philosophy together. We debate, we criticize, but we also have a good time together. I remember in my first weeks at university, a colleague who is now in teaching in North Carolina for reasons understood by any of us. Brought me into his office and we were discussing, I don't remember which topic of philosophy. 2 hours later, I said to him, oh my God, I've got to get to work. And he said, no, this is work. We've been doing work. And I thought, wow, work can be this much fun. This is great. Good. So that is also part of our culture, and I'm very, very grateful to the department for its support and for being a place in which philosophy can be practiced in such an enjoyable way. Now, enough of the fun stuff. It's time to get serious. I would like you to consider for a moment that this is your final hour. Your last hour on this earth will be spent with me. In this room, and at the end of the lecture, it will be literally lights out. No reception, not even a final drink. How would you feel about this news if you really believed it were true? I don't think you'd be laughing. I would be terrified. This is what Epicurus says about it. Accustom yourself to the belief that death is nothing to us. That bit of news I just imagined you receive, or I asked you to imagine you receive, should be nothing to you. You should meet it with complete calm and indifference. He realizes that this is a strange thought. That's why he says, accustom yourself to the belief. He doesn't expect you to take it in right away. This is in a letter to one of his pupils. And he says, he then provides an argument for this claim, or what looks like an argument, for all good and evil lie in sensation, which is often taken to be a terse statement of his hedonistic view of the good life, that pleasure is the only thing that's in and of itself good, and pain the only evil. So all good and evil lie in sensation, pleasures and pains, whereas death is the absence of sensation. And that part of the argument captures his assertion that, contrary to the myths of the time, you do not go to the underworld after you die, but we simply stop experiencing anything. We're made of atoms and we fall apart. Now, convinced? Not yet, I don't think, nor have nearly 2,500 years of philosophers. As we'll see as we go along, heaps of scorn have been poured on this argument and on Epicurus' view of the good life. My mission tonight is to try to offer, with the help of other interpreters along the way, but still I hope it is a new interpretation of Epicurus' thought. On this interpretation, I will propose to you, he offers quite an attractive view of the good life and pleasure, on which it is indeed correct that if you lived your life in that way, death would be nothing to you. Nonetheless, your life would be a good one. That has often seemed to be an impossible paradox. But nonetheless, I'll try to argue that it's true. I'll then also explain that this life comes at a price. Nothing is for free in this world. And then end trying to figure out whether we should pay the price for access to that life, which I'll argue is pleasurable, fit for us philosophers, and also would render death, render us immune from the harm of death. But before we go there, we should look at the standard interpretation, because there are many different interpretations, but I'll give you the most common one. And then I'll try to argue that this interpretation and the objections that come with it are mistaken. So here is this common interpretation. Premise 1, we assert hedonism. Pleasure is the only intrinsic good, pain the only intrinsic evil. By intrinsic, I mean good in and of itself, or bad in and of itself. The second, death, is simply the end of all sensation. We won't challenge that one. I've put in bronze what we will be challenging. And then supposedly therefore, a conclusion is drawn from simply these two premises: death is nothing to us. Now, philosophers have two ways of attacking arguments where they think the conclusion is dubious. First, they can attack the premises, and they can also attack the inference from the premises to the conclusion. And both types of attacks have been done historically. So let's start, I'll outline both attacks. Let's start with attacks on premise 1. Although first, let's remind ourselves of how attractive this has seemed from the dawn of time. Okay, so the very first, or at least some people tell me, the very first novel written is the Epic of Gilgamesh, and right there is a statement of hedonism by the goddess Siduri, depicted at the top. So we've just invented the story, and the first thing we tell ourselves is, you should lead the pleasurable life. And this is how she defines it. Fill your belly, day and night make merry. Let days be full of joy, dance and make music day and night. These things alone are concern. And you can see why this was attractive then, and has continued to be attractive through the ages to Jeremy Bentham, spiritual founding father of my university where I did my PhD, and to current colleagues who are still followers of the goddess Siduri. Richard Layard and Paul Dolan are still defenders of a form of hedonism. But what has been the criticism of this premise? Well, here's one criticism. It goes back to Aristotle. He says, I wish Paul were here, but he said he had to cancel at the last minute, Paul Dolan. The most vulgar would seem to conceive of happiness as pleasure, and hence they also like the life of gratification. A life they decide on is a life fit for grazing animals, not, as Aristotle says, any human good life has to be a life fit for a rational creature. Yes, pleasure is important, but it's not fit as the whole end of life for a rational creature. That's Aristotle's objection. We'll return to this objection. There's also a second objection, which says to Epicureans, even if we accept your premises, the conclusion doesn't follow. So that's the attack on the therefore here. Why is that? Well, look, death can be a comparative evil when it prevents more pleasurable time alive, even if it's not an intrinsic evil. So think about it as follows. This is your final hour on earth. Your death, all our deaths, robs us of a very pleasurable time at the reception afterwards with the finest wines that LSE has available. Bentham might have called them the greatest headache for the greatest number. Anyway, being dead isn't an intrinsic evil, but it's a comparative evil because it robs you of that extra good time you will have after this lecture is over. And this is, for example, how Bernard Williams has criticized the Epicureans. He says, consider two lives, one very short and the other containing enjoyment to a ripe age. If the good things in life are valuable, then more of them is better than less. But then it will just not be true that to die earlier is all the same as to die later. So, in the remainder of this lecture, I'm going to argue that both of these objections are fallacious, that there is indeed a good understanding of Epicurus' view, but it takes some work on which both Aristotle's objection and the invalidity objection are false. So let's start with Aristotle's objection, which is that the life of pleasure is fit only for grazing animals, not for rational beings like us. Well, here is what Epicurus himself says when addressing people who like the goddess Siduri claim that the life of pleasure is the one of indulgence. He says, what produces the pleasant life is not continuous drinking and parties, or I'm afraid I have to censor that because there are children in the audience, or womanizing, or the enjoyment of dishes at an expensive table, but sober reasoning. What you are doing right now is much more fun than the reception that will follow. Here's the other thing he says. Refer every choice to the health of the body and the soul's freedom from disturbance. Tranquility, as I will be calling it in this lecture. And finally, the most outrageous thing he says is this. The removal of all pain is the limit of the magnitude of pleasures. So now you might think, thanks a lot, Epicurus. Yeah, maybe you're attempting to answer Aristotle's objection, but what you've given us instead is not looking too good. So this is what some rival school of hedonists said at the time, the Cyrenaics. They didn't believe that the life of the mind was the most pleasurable life. They believed that maximal desire, you really make yourself desire something extremely strongly, and then you satisfy it. That is what the pleasurable life is. Okay. And so they said, by contrast, the life that Epicurus recommends to you, the limit of pleasure is arrived at when we have no more pains. Well, that's just the life of a corpse already, so no wonder you don't think that death is a big deal, right? If this is the most you can get out of life, might as well die right away. By the way, I have to quote here a church father, because it seems like the Cyrenaics were too busy having fun to write a lot of philosophy. So this is reporting what they said. Now, Cicero, who takes Epicurean philosophy very seriously, referring to the assertion that the limit of pleasure is arrived at when we've gotten rid of all pains, says, well, that is just an outright contradiction. And finally, a contemporary author of the book Morality of Happiness, Julia Annas, says, this is nobody's idea about how to maximize pleasure. So whatever Epicurus is up to, this is not exciting. Okay. Can we make sense of his view of pleasure, as I've indicated from those quotes? I think so, but be patient, it will take a little while. Let's start with the idea that the pleasurable life for Epicurus involves a form of tranquility, that's to say the absence of anxiety and mental distress. Now, when will an Epicurean feel distress? Well, like most of us, they will feel distress if they believe that either now or in the future, they are likely to face significant evils. If you think something really bad will soon happen to you, for example, that this is your final hour, right, and you have not yet been persuaded that death is nothing to you, you will get anxious, you will feel distressed. Okay. That's pretty straightforward. It follows, therefore, that if we're tranquil, if an Epicurean does not experience distress, you must not believe, they must not believe that they are vulnerable. Vulnerability implies anxiety, or belief in vulnerability implies anxiety. Absence of anxiety must therefore imply that you are not, that you do not believe that you are vulnerable. Now, there are two ways in which you could fail to have this belief. One is you have no opinion on the matter. I have no opinion, for example, on whether or not whether the rings of Saturn are made, what they're made of. Right? I have no beliefs about this. I have absolutely no knowledge. That's one way in which you could avoid believing that you're vulnerable. But that's not the way that Epicureans choose. They don't suspend belief or have no belief about their vulnerability. They're always writing about our vulnerability. Right? They want to investigate. So if we assume, which is very plausible, that Epicureans form beliefs about vulnerability, then it simply follows that a tranquil Epicurean must believe that they are not vulnerable. By not being vulnerable, I don't mean they're the man of steel, right? Nothing would possibly harm them. What I mean instead is they believe that they're sufficiently, this is a threshold concept here, sufficiently unlikely to face significant evils. Now, how could they arrive, or how could we, if we want to become Epicureans, achieve a justified belief in invulnerability? So we've linked tranquility to belief in invulnerability. How could such a belief be justified? Well, Epicurus focuses on the core source of our vulnerability, which is the frustration of an important, strongly held desire. If I think that my strongly held desire to have a glass of Prosecco after this lecture with all of you will be thwarted, right, then I will perceive this as an evil. And that will cause me anxiety. Now, one way in which we can avoid this anxiety about the frustration of our desires is by limiting our desires, obviously, not by getting more stuff, but by limiting our desires and eliminating false beliefs. And that's what I'll pursue with you for a moment now. And here I'm drawing on some work by Martha Nussbaum in the Therapy of Desire, explaining the Epicurean view, which is basically that we have three types of desires. The first is what he calls natural and necessary, and that's for the things up there, the basic necessities of life: water, food, shelter, clothing. And you see the little guy waving at you, he's your friend. Right? Epicureans also believe that friendship was essential to the good life. Now, these are the things we require for bodily and mental well-being, and those desires we should simply try to satisfy. Although I'll say a little bit more about them in a moment, about the way in which we ought to hold them. So this is not, Epicurus is not proposing that we rid ourselves of these desires, but he thinks, under reasonably fortunate socioeconomic circumstances, we can arrange our lives so that we can be quite certain that these will be satisfied. Then he says there are natural and unnecessary desires. What does he mean by this? Well, let me give an example. Do any of you know the Durex commercial, Protect Yourself? And so what happens in the Durex commercial, Protect Yourself, is a guy, that guy is barbecuing. He's trying to have a lovely barbecue. He's got juiciest steaks already. And a kid is running around the garden, his kid, puts out the barbecue. It's frustrating, he has to do it again. And then just at the moment when he tries to put the steak on the barbecue, the kid starts beating him around the head with a plastic sword. At that point, the Durex sign comes up and says, protect yourself. So, what would Epicurus say about this? Well, if you have children, it's natural that you will care about them and have all this anxiety and concern, but it's an unnecessary desire because you don't have to have children. Protect yourself. Yeah, it's a bit late, I hear some of you thinking. Okay, finally, empty. He says these are desires that are based on false beliefs. So the desire to take care of your children is not based on a false belief, but the desire to live forever to avoid going to hell, this is the Greek depiction of hell, right? There's Hades, the god of the underworld, and his three-headed dog. Once you are persuaded by philosophy that there is no hell, those desires, ones based on false belief, just disappear. So Epicurus basically says, limit yourself to the natural and necessary desires, which are, he believes, under ordinary circumstances, relatively easy to satisfy. But I think we have to go a little bit further. And here, I want to draw on something Bernard Williams says in that article, which I introduced earlier when he's criticizing the Epicureans. He says something actually which I think can help us understand the Epicurean view, but is not explicit in Epicurus himself. Williams draws the distinction between what he calls categorical desires and merely conditional desires. And I'll explain this distinction as follows. Categorical desires, here's my friends and me drinking champagne on the top of Mount Olympus, just like the gods in the picture, the invite for this talk. We went there last summer. Now, before I went up the mountain, I had what Williams would call a categorical desire. I want to make it to the top with my friends. That is a reason to keep going through life. If I had died on the way up, and as some of you know, there was a hairy moment, or at least we believed ourselves to be in danger. I'm not sure we actually were, but anyway, then that would cause me anxiety, the frustration of a categorical desire, which is about, I want to arrive at some future state, to spend time with my friends. But one could also have the following types of desires. Merely conditional. If I'm alive next year, then I want to spend time with my friends. But it's not the case that I want to be alive next year in order to spend time with my friends. Now, what this means is as follows. If I'm around next year, yes, I would like your company. But your company is not pulling me into the future, so to speak. That is the distinction. If I were alone next year and alive, that would be bad, because my desire, my merely conditional desire, would be frustrated, or if I spent it with people I loathe. But if I spend it in the company of friends, that's great. If I die before I get there, this does not frustrate my merely conditional desire. So, what do we learn from this typology of desires? Here's what I think Epicurus is trying to tell us. Limit yourself to desires which cannot be frustrated by death and which are unlikely to be frustrated otherwise. So one way they could be frustrated is you're alive, but your friends aren't there, or your basic needs aren't met. He said, well, there's an easy solution to that. Live simply in a hippie commune, the garden on the edge of Athens, right? And then you will justifiably feel invulnerable. So this is what you end up having: natural, necessary, but merely conditional desires for friendship and basic needs being met, and under decent socioeconomic circumstances. Here we have a version of the philosopher's garden on the edge of Athens. In the imagination, there's the Parthenon. And you spend your time with others who are your friends, but they don't cause you anxiety because they themselves are Epicureans. What a nice department that would be, Richard. Good. Now, we've linked tranquility to a sense of invulnerability, but remember we started on this trying to figure out what pleasure was for Epicurus. So why is the sense of invulnerability that we've just outlined pleasurable? What's so good about it? Well, first, of course, you can feel safe if you're invulnerable. You will feel in control because you've arranged your desires and your social environment so that you will always, or you're pretty sure to get what you want. And therefore, you will also be satisfied or content. So those are already three major things which many of us lack in our everyday life: feeling safe, in control, and content, which the Epicurean can have. But we can go further in the diversity of pleasures open to the tranquil. Gisela Stryker, in a very interesting article, strangely, in which she ends up concluding that Epicureanism is a hoax, she does make this interesting contribution, which she says, look, imagine yourself in the tranquil state, getting, say, a piece of cheese. Why do I mention cheese? Because about 99% of Epicurus's works were destroyed. The man wrote 300 books. We have just a smattering of fragments, including, strangely, a letter to his mother and a shopping list. And the shopping list contains a pot of cheese. So imagine that you're a tranquil Epicurean tasting the feta. Will you enjoy it? Well, yes, maximally. I mean, there you are, unperturbed, tranquil, open to every pleasure of the moment. The sunlight strikes your face, that will be pleasurable. A friend starts a philosophical conversation, that will be pleasurable. In other words, you're in a state in which the fleeting everyday pleasures will have their maximal effect. There's a further pleasure open to you, which is what Hume, later in the Treatise on Human Nature, calls the pleasure of comparison. And what he means is, he says, normally Hume discusses a case in which you consider someone who's worse off than you. You may feel sympathy for them, that makes you feel sad, but you also feel relief. Oh, that's not me. Now, Epicurus, very kindly, talks about the past self when he talks about the pleasures of comparison. He says, the limit of the pleasure in the mind is produced by reflecting on things which used to present it with its greatest fears. So there you are, a tranquil Epicurean. You, like everybody else, used to be terrified of death, no longer. That comparison gives you pleasure. But later, Epicureans were not quite so kind. This is what Lucretius, a follower of Epicurus, who gave the Elethy its motto, to know the cause of things, comes from his poem, where the same quote is here. When the winds are troubling the sea, it is a pleasure to view from land another man's great struggles, because it is a pleasure to observe from what troubles you are free. And if you think this is nasty, I think it's just human nature. All of us can feel some relief along with sympathy if we think of other people who are in more trouble than we are. And then he says, pleasantest of all is to be master of the tranquil regions fortified by the teaching of the wise. From there, you can look down on others. So this is Lucretius, not Epicurus. Let's grant the master a bit more humanity, but still, the pleasures of comparison are there for the taking once you become tranquil. Finally, there's the pleasure of pride. Why pride? This is what Epicurus says, not proud because you have an adoring crowd at your inaugural lecture. No, proud because you've become self-sufficient, proud of your own goods, not of their circumstances. Or, as he puts it later, in relation to fortune, which is the great threat to our happiness. There's the wheel of fortune in a medieval manuscript. Someone's on the up, he's happy, he's a king at the top, and then the fall starts. And you never know when fortune will stop spinning, the wheel of fortune. Epicurus says, I have anticipated you, fortune, and have barred your means of entry. We shall depart from life, declaring in a song of triumph over fortune how well we have lived. So the pride comes in achieving mastery, in achieving self-control, control of one's fate. So recall the idea, the Cyrenaics said, Epicurus is talking about the condition of a corpse when he's talking about the greatest pleasure. Cicero said it's an outright contradiction. And Julia Anna said this is no one's idea of maximizing pleasure. Here are the pleasures of invulnerability, which I think Epicurus is inviting us to enjoy: feeling safe, in control and content, unperturbed perception and thought, comparison and pride. But you might still say, are these the best pleasures? Do they maximize pleasure? Well, here I think we have to keep in mind, thank you. We have to keep in mind that there need not be any such single quality of pleasure. So colleagues like the ones I mentioned earlier, following Bentham, like Paul Dolan, for example, do measurements of people's intensity of pleasure. So they might, for example, burst into the room and ask you, on a scale from 0 to 6, how much fun are you having in this lecture? Right? And then we could do that at various points, and we could add up the total amount of pleasure, subtracting the pains that you're experiencing in this period of time. That assumes that there's a single quantity, measurable quantity of pleasure, and it just comes in a sense of intensity on a scale. Now, no such thing is implied by the concept of pleasure in ordinary language, right? The pleasures of poetry, of a good conversation with my head of department, a walking up Mount Olympus with my friends, right? All of these different pleasures simply have different qualities, and it's not clear that I can put them on one single scale. So if there is no such scale, that means there's room for judgment. Room for judging that some pleasures, though all pleasures are good, some pleasures are more valuable than others, without appealing directly to some scale of intensity. So this is what I think Epicurus is doing. He says tranquility yields the greatest, and by greatest, I propose he means most worthwhile, not necessarily the most intense, the most worthwhile pleasures, because it is generated by the exercise of theoretical and practical reasons. What does that mean? How do we become tranquil? Remember, first we have to banish superstition, get rid of belief in the afterlife. We do that as a consequence of philosophy, of understanding that the end of us is the end of our experience, that there is no afterlife, that this is all just myth. Okay. We also have to use practical reason. We have to figure out how to live well, and we have to discipline our desires. Now, those are exercises of reason, and it's because we achieve tranquility through the exercise of reason, or at least it's open to Epicurus to claim that that is why they are most worthwhile. And notice that we've now answered Aristotle's objection. Aristotle said, a life of pleasure is fit for grazing animals, not for human beings, not for rational beings. Not this type of pleasure. This type of pleasure, the pleasure you're experiencing right now, the pleasure of philosophy, right, is unique to us and is what Epicurus is after, at least a significant part of what he's after. Okay, so we've answered Aristotle's objection, but what about the different objection, which is even if we grant Epicurus's premises, the conclusion doesn't follow. That's the invalidity objection. It it's clear from some fragments of Epicurus that he had this objection already in mind. Because here's one of the fragments. He says, the flesh places the limits of pleasure at infinity and needs an infinite time. I think he means here, so to speak, Aristotle's the vulgar, the common masses, you guys, before the lecture started. It's of course captured in Greek myths. What is the Greek myth of the ideal life? The one on the obscured picture behind you, right? Eternally young gods living forever on the Olympus, partying, getting bored, starting a war just for the hell of it, right? And getting involved with a variety of mortals and then partying again. This is the ordinary view of the good life in his time. But he says the intellect brings about the complete life, so that when circumstances bring about our departure, it does not suppose that it has fallen short of the best life. Notice that he's engaging directly here with this issue of comparison, which is more life, more pleasurable time is needed to make your life better still. Epicurus seems to deny this. He says, at least it's possible to achieve a complete life within a limited amount of time. More pleasurable time alive would be good, but wouldn't make your life as a whole better. Now, Cicero again is ready to prick this balloon and say, what nonsense. One who thinks that life is made complete by pleasure, how can he be consistent if he denies that pleasure increases by duration? What rubbish. Let's see if we can save Epicurus from Cicero's objection. We've already made an argument for why the greatest pleasures are attained in the tranquil state, the pleasures of invulnerability. And we've also seen that it's conceptually part of being in the tranquil state that you have no desires that can be frustrated by death. Now, what does this mean? One of those desires that could be frustrated by death is to have more time alive. To be around next year so I can do another Olympus climb with my friends. But if I had that desire, I would not be tranquil because I would be vulnerable to death. Especially among the Greek times in which Epicurus is writing, in which I looked it up, a person in the midst of their life, say 42, right, had a 10% chance of dying in the next 5 years. So that would be present in your mind as a constant risk. Now this means that to be tranquil, it's a precondition for entering into the tranquil state and tasting the greatest pleasures, that you desire more time alive only conditionally. If I'm around next year, I would like to be in the tranquil state, enjoying time with my friends, eating cheese in the garden on the edge of Athens. But that to be there doesn't propel me into the future. So, to enter the tranquil state, to taste the pleasures of invulnerability, you have to believe your life is complete. You must not desire life, more life categorically, only conditionally. So here's the Epicurean view of the best life that we arrive at. You achieve tranquility and remain tranquil until death. If you've achieved tranquility at 42 and you die at 43, you've achieved the best life. If you continue, as Epicurus did, until the age of 70, you also have lived the best possible life. This is how he who regards pleasure as the end of the good life, right? Cicero's description of Epicurus, can consistently hold that more time alive doesn't make your life better. So here we are with Epicurus's argument on death. Remember, we're trying to address the idea that his argument is invalid. Here's a version of the argument which is valid. We start with the same two premises we began with. Pleasure is the only intrinsic good, pain the only intrinsic evil. death is the end of all sensation, therefore the end of all intrinsic and intrinsic evils and goods, we can conclude death is not intrinsically bad. We add what we've just been arguing for: the best life is one in which one has achieved tranquility and remains tranquil until death. Of course, it follows once you're in the tranquil state, death is not comparatively bad either. So we've answered the invalidity objection in the following way. Death, we can now conclude, is nothing bad, not quite nothing, but nothing bad, to us. And notice who the us is. In the original version of the argument, the way we present it to first-year undergraduates in philosophy, the us is all of us. Death is nothing to any of us. That is not what Epicurus is saying on this reconstructed version of his argument. Death is nothing to us Epicureans, we who have achieved tranquility. Death might be a lot to you who are not yet tranquil, if you are not yet tranquil, because it might stop you from achieving the good life, which is the tranquil life. If you're on your way to become tranquil, and death strikes you down before you have yet mastered your desires, withdrawn to the garden and to live peacefully together with your friends in simplicity, then death is an evil for you because it frustrates what should be your one categorical desire: to become an Epicurean sage. So the us is not us. Remember, it's from a letter to a fellow Epicurean, us Epicureans. And this also helps answer the argument, some of the frustration that some philosophers have expressed over the ages. So I mentioned Gisela Stryker before. She ends her argument saying Epicureanism is a hoax because who could believe that the death of an 18-year-old on the cusp of becoming an adult is not a tragedy? If that 18-year-old would have gone on to lead a good life.
Now, dear students, if you understand this lecture, you must answer the question for express control. You saw this question in my slide. If you don't understand or you need some help, you must read the literature. You saw this literature in the slide. It's literature for you. If you need anything to help you, it's literature for you. Thank you and goodbye.